Hey there, interwebs. I'm finally back, and just in time for my favorite part of the year, spooky season. 'Tis the time for bonfires on brisk evenings, for dark deeds and black masses as the barrier between the realms grows thin, and benighted rites of witches, vampires, and other night weirds. That's why today, I want to discuss Dracula by Bram Stoker, an early work of Feminist lit. Hold up, what? I hear you cry? How is Dracula, a gothic horror story from the Victorian era, a feminist piece? I'm glad you asked, but before I explain, I strongly advise you to actually read the book if you haven't already. It's an obvious disclaimer, but it still feels necessary because this video isn't about the Dracula mythos in pop culture. It's about Bram Stoker's Dracula, and reading the novel will give you the context upon which the rest of this video is built. It's also going to get very spoilery. But how can I possibly spoil Dracula, you may be wondering? It's been around for more than 120 years. Everyone already knows the story. But do you really? If you haven't actually read it, I'd wager you only know of it through adaptation, and in the words of Orson Welles, director and narrator of the Dracula radio drama, Dracula would make a marvelous movie. In fact, nobody has ever made it. All the movies are based on the play. To cut a long story short, as indeed many of the adaptations have, the novel's earliest adaptations took some pretty heavy liberties with the source material, and it's only been a game of Transylvanian whispers ever since. This has naturally led to some quite significant differences between the works, and the characters were not exempt. For example, the novel's titular villain isn't terribly suave or charming. Van Helsing also isn't a seasoned monster hunter, Renfield isn't a feeble quisling, and most important to this video, Lucy isn't a slut. Let me back up. In order to analyze Dracula as a feminist piece, we obviously have to focus on its two principal female characters, Miss Lucy Westenra and Mrs. Mina Harker. The former is of particular importance because, well, most female characters in fiction are principally defined by their relationship to a male character, but Stoker's Dracula subtly flips this on its head. Nearly every one of the good guys is actually either a good gal or a love interest of one, and Lucy's at the center of it all. Every major character in the story is only one step removed from her, or two at the absolute most. Her three suitors are the good Dr. John Jack Seward, to whom Van Helsing and Renfield are colleague and patient, respectively, the rootin'-tootin' pistol-shootin' American cowboy Quincy P. Morris, and the dull-as-dishwater Arthur Holmwood, future Lord Godalming, whom she chooses to marry. Mina is her strictly platonic girlfriend, and Jonathan Harker is Mina's significant other. Even the fearsome Count Dracula, the novel's namesake antagonist, can still be defined by his role as her attacker. Suffice to say, Lucy is the narrative linchpin without which all else would fall to pieces, so it should come as no surprise then that many a critical eye has already been cast over her character, but different analysts have come away from the experience with vastly different interpretations. Some people are of the opinion that the story of Dracula gives off misogynistic vibes, and these criticisms almost inevitably center on Lucy. Detractors feel that her death is a way of punishing the woman for having multiple romantic partners. Furthermore, they argue, the Count would have never gotten a preternatural foothold in England without her. Ergo, a woman nearly brought about the fall of Great Britain due to her romantic profligacy, making Lucy to blame for much weeping and gnashing of proverbial teeth. In the words of Kate Beaton of Hark, a Vagrant, this novel is written to tell ladies that if you're not a submissive waif, society goes to hell and ungodly monsters are going to turn you into child-killing horrors, as you deserve. Obviously, we know there's nothing wrong with a little consensual promiscuity these days, but back in the Victorian era when the story was written, such a concept was rather taboo, so the death of a woman engaged in such behavior could have been seen as a kind of karmic justice. Does this make Stoker's Dracula one of the earliest works to employ the death by promiscuity trope in horror fiction? Well, no. Although many adaptations like to put the loose in Lucy, in the original novel she was never anything but the perfect chaste ingenue. True, she was courted by 3 men, but she wasn't romantically or sexually involved with 3 men, and while she lamented that she couldn't marry all of them, she accepted this as the unfortunate truth of her situation. In her own words, I burst into tears, and I really felt very badly. Why can't they let a girl marry 3 men, or as many as want her, and save all this trouble? But this is heresy, and I must not say it. Lucy received 3 proposals, made her decision, and that was that. She didn't then go about conducting illicit affairs behind her fiancé's back. She was neither some wanton trollop sleeping with her suitors, nor a flirt leading them on. In canonical fact, Lucy Westenra is the embodiment of traditional values, modeling correct behavior for young women, and her only flaw is being too beautiful. I won't mark this against Stoker, however, because he used the concept very deliberately to deconstruct the idea, as we'll see in a moment. Adaptations that don't turn Lucy into a slut, and even some which do, tend to reduce her 3 suitors to 1, either by cutting out 2 of them, or by combining their traits into a new composite character. They can generally pull this off because her fiancé is a standard vanilla Ken doll, and John and Quincy are little more than the same character in doctor and cowboy outfits. To be blunt, there's just not a whole lot of depth to them. That's why I find it especially amusing that the three are courting Lucy, who is probably the second most complex character in the whole book. I'd also like to add something else about Lucy and her trio of suitors. If this were a modern romantic comedy, and I'm putting separate air quotes around romantic and comedy, the three men would be at each other's throats trying to win Lucy's affection. Happily, however, this is a gothic horror novel, and they all get along just fine, even joining together to slay the monster that's been at Lucy's throat. And that brings us to the other half of Lucy's character, the dark reflection. You see, Lucy doesn't just die after Dracula has sucked her dry like a human Capri Sun pouch. She becomes a vampiress, putting her very soul at risk. This is because vampirism isn't merely some disease that yoinks the soul out of a body and starts renting the property out to a new demon with pointier teeth. Instead, it seems to corrupt what is already there. As Van Helsing puts it, when this now undead be made to rest as true dead, then the soul of the poor lady whom we love shall again be free. Instead of working wickedness by night and growing more debased in the assimilating of it by day, she shall take her place with the other angels. In other words, Lucy the vampire is still Lucy, which means that we can infer aspects of her character from her posthumous behavior. To illustrate, let us compare the vampiric Lucy to the Count's trio of female companions. I'm genuinely at a loss for what to call them, because although they're generally known as the brides of Dracula in popular culture these days, nowhere in the novel are they referred to as such. What's more, the most credible theory I've seen posits that only one is Dracula's wife, while the other two are their daughters, based on Jonathan's description of the trio. Two were dark and had high aquiline noses, like the Count, and great dark piercing eyes. The other was fair as can be, with great wavy masses of golden hair and eyes like pale sapphires. In less flowery language, two of them have dark hair and facial features similar to their supposed father, while the third is blonde and looks nothing like Drac, but seems to exert authority over the pair. When they attempt to feed on Jonathan, one of the theoretical daughters tells her, "You are first, and we shall follow. Yours is the right to begin." She also has the biggest and most opulent tomb, second only to that of the Count himself. When destroying these tombs and staking their occupants, Van Helsing does refer to the two brunettes as sisters, but it's possible he is speaking metaphorically, and the Dutchman mangles metaphors like they owe him money. Regardless, any claim made on the trio's exact relationship is going to be based on very little evidence, seeing as they only appear in 2 scenes in the entire book. It's entirely possible that all three are Dracula's wives or lovers, which, if true, creates an interesting parallel with Lucy. Not only is she one of the good guys, she's inarguably the purest cinnamon roll in the whole novel, and she receives marriage proposals from 3 different men, on the same day no less. Dracula, meanwhile, is evil incarnate and cohabitates with 3 alleged lovers of his own. The difference is that Lucy loves her suitors, whereas the blonde bride accuses Dracula as follows: "You yourself never loved. You never love." In the bride's, for lack of a better word, introductory scene, they nearly eat Jonathan, and the manner in which they prey upon him is more than a little erotic. In his journal, he describes the encounter as follows: "The girl went on her knees and bent over me, simply gloating. There was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive, and as she arched her neck she actually licked her lips like an animal, till I could see in the moonlight the moisture shining on the scarlet lips and on the red tongue as it lapped at the white sharp teeth. Lower and lower went her head as the lips went below the range of my mouth and chin and seemed about to fasten on my throat. I closed my eyes in languorous ecstasy and waited with beating heart." The women likely would have succeeded in their carnal conquest had Dracula not intervened at the last possible moment, having brought home vampiric takeout. "Honeys, I'm home, and I brought a bag of squalling infant, even picked up tender and mild sauce." Obviously I'm paraphrasing at this point, but you get the gist. The vampire brides are wanton and voluptuous, and they literally eat babies. Lucy as a vampire also feeds on children, which is where she earned the appellation of the Bloofer Lady, Bloofer being a childish mispronunciation of the word beautiful. This epithet, along with the fact that her victims lived long enough to give it to her, indicates that falling prey to the vampiric Lucy, or the Bloofer Lady as I will henceforth be calling her, is not the erotically traumatic experience which the brides visited upon Jonathan. Lucy was a kind, gentle, and caring young woman when she was alive, and the Bloofer Lady plays with her victims, not in a cat-and-mouse way, which we might imagine the sadistic brides employing, but rather in a dreadfully sweet way. When one of her child victims awakes in hospital, he, to quote Seward's diary, asks the nurse if he might go away. When she asked him why he wanted to go, he said he wanted to play with the Bloofer Lady. That's right, even after becoming the Bloofer Lady's midnight snack, his first request upon regaining consciousness is to be allowed to play with her again. I can't imagine any of the bride's victims feeling the same way, if they lived long enough to feel anything ever again. What we can take away from all this, I believe, is some indication that vampirism is a force of corruption, one which twists a person's nature rather than completely overwriting it, leaving behind recognizable aspects of the person the victim once was. As Seward puts it, the Bloofer Lady is a devilish mockery of Lucy's sweet purity. Unfortunately, we never really get a picture of what the brides were like in life, so Lucy's transformation to the Bloofer Lady is all we really have to go on. We also get to see, however, how vampirism perverts another aspect of her character, her love for Arthur. Lucy seemed to genuinely love, or at least care deeply about, all three of her suitors, but not in a wanton way. The Bloofer Lady, by contrast, takes this affection and twists it into something much more lascivious. In the novel's own words, the sweetness was turned to adamantine, heartless cruelty, and the purity to voluptuous wantonness. It is only at this point that Lucy starts behaving in any way which is sexually forward, after she gets vamped. Her death, therefore, can't be a punishment for promiscuity. In brief, Lucy's model purity doesn't protect her from evil, it exposes her to it, and we the audience are shown all too vividly what happens to her womanly virtue once the corruption sets in. Lucy is still there, in some way, but the innocence is gone. Lucy isn't the only young woman to come down with a nasty case of fangs in the novel, however. We still have to take a look at the other female principal character in this story, Mrs. Wilhelmina Mina Harker, née Murray. If Lucy is the archetypical damsel in distress, then Mina is the knight in shining armor, and I'm not saying so ironically. Not only is she the primary contributor to the monster's undoing, she's arguably the protagonist of the whole story, and this notion is subtly supported by the ways in which she and her husband Jonathan are addressed. As previously mentioned, just about every male character in this story is defined by his role in relation to either Lucy or Mina, and Jonathan Harker is no exception. At various points throughout the novel, he is referred to as Mina's husband, or husband of Madame Mina, by Van Helsing, when normally it would be the other way around. More traditional works would refer to her as Mrs. Jonathan Harker, but not here. In Bram Stoker's Dracula, Jonathan is Mrs. Mina's husband. This simple inversion of terminology shows that a woman can be married without being a possession of her spouse. Unlike Lucy, Mina is betrothed, but she is also liberated, or, to use the terminology of the time, a new woman. For those unaware, the New Woman was a sort of proto-feminist movement in which women were being more assertive and establishing their independence in society. Mina derides the concept and its adherents at various points in her journal, saying things like, "I suppose the New Woman won't condescend in future to accept marriage proposals. She will do the proposing herself, and a nice job she will make of it, too." It is rather ironic, then, that Mina is much more of a new woman than Lucy ever was. And remember, a novel is a closed space, one created from nothing, so nothing in it is an accident. If Stoker included multiple mentions of the New Woman and feminist ideology in association with Mina, it was because he wanted us to have these ideas in mind. It is only right, I feel, to conclude that Mina is meant to be a feminist character, and that this interpretation is not one imposed on the text ex post facto. So, what does Mina actually do? What is her role in the novel, besides act as dramatic foil to Lucy, and how does she contribute to the villain's defeat? Well, to be brief, Mina does everything. Like certain Republicans, Team Harker set out to stop the Count, but they actually succeeded, and that's largely thanks to Mina. She collects the team's notes and pieces together the mystery, uses her psychic connection with Dracula to locate him, coordinates train and shipping schedules to track him down, and manages just about every other aspect of the hunt as well. After creating the final itinerary for Dracula's destruction and saving the day for the umpteenth time, she recounts, "Jonathan took me in his arms and kissed me. The others kept shaking me by both hands, and Dr. Van Helsing said, 'Our dear Madame Mina is once more our teacher. Her eyes have been where we were blinded.'" To be frank, Van Helsing recognized Mina's aptitude from the word go. In their first face-to-face meeting, she presents him with her gathered notes thus far, and by the time he's done reading them, he cannot contain his excitement, exclaiming, "Oh, Madame Mina, how can I say what I owe to you? This paper is as sunshine. It opens the gate to me. I am dazed, I am dazzled with so much light. I am grateful to you, you so clever woman. There are darknesses in life, and there are lights. You are one of the lights. You will have happy life and good life, and your husband will be blessed in you." Suffice to say, Van Helsing is head over heels for her, and I am too. If you want to know the full extent of Mina's contribution to Team Harker, you really do have to read the novel. They say that if you want to get ahead in business, don't befriend the boss, befriend the boss's secretary. Well, Mina is functionally Team Harker's secretary, and she is a total boss. And she's a tough cookie, too. Although Seward remarks that men and women are so different in manifestations of nervous strength or weakness, she is basically the emotional rock of Team Harker, often maintaining her composure better than her husband. Even Seward notes that when recounting how Dracula assaulted her, it is Mina offering comfort to her husband. As she tells the story, Jonathan makes a pained groan, and so Mina clasped his hand harder and looked at him pityingly, as if he were the injured one. I don't even think it's a stretch to say that Mina doesn't so much contribute to her team as carry it. At multiple points throughout the latter stages of the novel, she basically says, "All right, I'll let the men handle it," only to have to roll up her sleeves the very next day like, "I shouldn't have let the men handle it." Take for example when Team Harker plans to destroy Dracula's coffins in England, but they ask Mina to stay behind. And now for you, Madam Mina, this night is the end until all be well. You are too precious to us to have such risk. When we part tonight, you no more must question. We shall tell you all in good time. We are men and are able to bear, but you must be our star and our hope, and we shall act all the more free that you are not in the danger, such as we are. All the men, even Jonathan, seemed relieved, but it did not seem to me good that they should brave danger and perhaps lessen their safety, strength being the best safety, through care of me, but their minds were made up, and, though it was a bitter pill for me to swallow, I could say nothing, save to accept their chivalrous care of me. It's less than a day before this decision to cut Mina out of the action comes back to bite them in the ass, and her in the neck. Later, Mina has the brilliant idea to use her newfound psychic connection to the Count to divine his location via hypnosis, but in the very next chapter, the men decide to shut her out of their plans once again, lest Dracula use this same connection to spy on them. Or, as Van Helsing puts it, we must keep her ignorant of our intent, so she cannot tell what she know not. Mina, however, is having none of that nonsense for a second time, and puts her foot down the next morning, insisting, "You must take me with you. I am safer with you, and you shall be safer too. Besides, I may be of service, since you can hypnotize me, and so learn that which even I myself do not know." And of course she is correct. By the time Team Harker is racing to Transylvania in the novel's climax, they've learned their lesson about underestimating Mina merely on the basis of gender. Van Helsing remarks, "She has man's brain, a brain that a man should have were he much gifted, and a woman's heart. The good God fashioned her for a purpose, believe me, when he made that so good combination." I'll admit, I'm simping for her more than a little bit, but only because she is the rarest of flowers. A female fictional character who is not a completely unflappable ice queen, but whom I think could change a flat tire without crying. She is, as Van Helsing puts it, a pearl among women, but I digress. Ultimately, as if to underline Mina's intellectual and emotional strength, and her overall importance to the novel, its final lines are delivered by Van Helsing with the Harker's new son seated upon his knee. He says, "This boy will someday know what a brave and gallant woman his mother is. Already he knows her sweetness and loving care. Later on he will understand how some men so loved her that they did dare much for her sake." Again, these are the final lines of the novel, the words which Stoker chose to leave us with, and their plaudits for Mina and her non-traditional behavior. What conclusion, therefore, should we as readers draw from this? Although Mina may have scoffed at terms like modern woman, she is, to use a modern term, a bad bitch, especially when balanced against Lucy as the novel's archetypal good girl. It's telling that Lucy, the woman whom everyone wants Mina. And that brings us back to the Lucy-Mina dichotomy. Lucy was everything a traditional, proper young lady should be. Kind, gentle-hearted, and overall an innocent girl who didn't have a flaw apart from naivete, but her purity and virginity did nothing to protect the poor dear from the monstrously rapacious Count Dracula. Mina, meanwhile, is much more liberated and independent, and almost certainly not a virgin by the end of the book, presumably having had her wedding night after being reunited with Jonathan, and yet this modern woman, more than any other character, is ultimately responsible for Dracula's defeat. Obviously, either of these two women on her own would make for an interesting character study, but when examined together, they send a message with an ineluctable conclusion. Purity, innocence, and traditional values won't save you, but hiking up your skirts and taking matters à deux mains gets things done. Or, in other words, well-behaved women seldom slay vampires. Thanks for watching, and have a happy Halloween. I also find myself wondering what would have happened to Lucy if Team Harker had killed Dracula before killing her. It is clearly established that ridding the world of Mina's vampiric sire cured her of her otherwise imminent case of vampirism, but it's never really indicated what happened to the fully fledged vampires Dracula already created. It is my personal belief that had Lucy still been undead at the time of Drac's demise, she would have simply reverted to being a regular old corpse, since the spell would be broken. But what if she didn't? Sure, Lucy as the Bloofer lady wandered the countryside at night literally drinking children, but how much of her evil was from Dracula's influence? She might be one of those perfectly benign vampires following his destruction. The only moral dilemma at that point is what's she going to eat, because she can't go on drinking children. I shouldn't have to say it, but it's true. Hey, doesn't Quincy come from a cattle ranching background? Could Lucy sustain herself with the blood of livestock? Also, I made joke about Quincy Yeehaw Morris being 20 gallons worth of American stereotypes stuffed in a 10-gallon hat, but to be fair, most of the particularly egregious examples of his American dialect are an affectation he adopts because Lucy thinks it's cute and he wants to make her happy. That being said, he did reflexively hip-fire at a passing bat on the off-chance that this one particular animal might be Dracula in disguise, so it's not all an act. I guess it's true that you can take the man out of America, but you can't take the etc. Renfield is arguably a wild card, and it may be best to think of him as this work's Gollum. Unlike later adaptations which paint him as Dracula's henchman, in the original novel he is less a willing servant of evil, and more so a mentally ill man being manipulated by it. He even goes down swinging, trying to kill Dracula after learning that he's been lied to and betrayed, and he uses his final moments to give Team Harker what he can to ensure that they have the best chance of stopping his abuser. While it's true that Van Helsing and Mina do 99% of the actual work of thwarting Dracula, and the latter is the real MVP, can we just take a moment to admire the absolute balls on her husband? Jonathan Harker starts the novel as little more than a foodie with a travel diary to make an otherwise dull business trip a little less ponderous, and he can't even handle paprika. He then spends the first chunk of the novel as the eponymous villain's prisoner, being used and abused and having his sanity slowly chipped away at until he's eventually convinced that the entire awful experience was all in his head, and then he disappears from the novel for a while. The next time we see him, there's no account of what all transpired in between, but we have enough clues and hints to piece together what must have happened, so let me spell it out for you. Harker free-climbed down the side of a castle and escaped through a hostile environment while being pursued by ravenous wolves and/or the so-called Brides of Dracula, navigating large expanses of unsettled wilderness with no survival supplies in a country where he barely speaks the language on the other side of the continent from his home, and crossed an international border to safety. By the time he gets back to England, he's practically a grizzled veteran, and once he knows that Dracula is in town, he doesn't go anywhere without a kukri because he is vampire hunting and ready to throw hands at a moment's notice. He's even the one to score the killing blow on Drac, chopping his head off with said knife. Bravo, sir! Outside of canon, it is my belief that Lucy is/was polyamorous, and also possibly pansexual based on her letters to Mina. Incidentally, if there are any fanfic writers out there listening, I would love to read a work wherein Lucy survives as a lawful good vampire and continues existence with her gender-flipped harem of 3 husbands. The ideas of polyamory and polyandry are alluded to in one of her early letters to Mina. Why can't they let a girl marry 3 men, or as many as want her, and save all this trouble? Dr. Van Helsing even jokes about Lucy being a polyandrist after Holmwood states that the transfusion of his blood into her veins makes her his bride, unaware that he was one of multiple men to do so. I can't afford to commission a piece, but if it's any good, I'll yodel its praises from the rooftop.